My hands rested on the console, fingers twitching with anticipation. The station emitted a soft murmur around me, the low, almost comforting vibration of the Asterisk Drift's life support systems. A sound you only noticed when it stopped. Not that it ever had. I flicked through the data on the screen, the reflection of my own eyes staring back at me, bloodshot from the hours I'd spent here over the last week. There was something hypnotic about the numbers as they crawled across the interface, equations rolling over into infinity. We were close. So close. Years of research, theories discarded and rewritten, about to culminate in a single moment. Aboard the Asterisk Drift, the silence had become a second skin. Out here, at the farthest edge of the solar system, there wasn't much conversation. Not anymore. The other pods, hollowed-out metal cells, stood unused, their occupants long since departed. Left behind were the last remnants of this operation, me, a skeleton crew, and the research. I rubbed my eyes. The starlight scarcely penetrated the thick blackness that stretched infinitely beyond the station's viewport. I'd long since stopped looking outside. Nothing out there could compare to what we were doing here. Phase 0 is scheduled for 6 a.m. tomorrow, Dr. Devereaux. The voice came through my earpiece. It was Halverson, one of the few remaining techs who hadn't yet succumbed to the creeping boredom that had claimed so many before. Efficient, if nothing else. Copy that, I muttered. I didn't need reminding. I knew the schedule by heart. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. A lattice of wires and pipes, all necessary to keep us alive in the void. The station's artificial atmosphere pressed down on me. I never quite got used to it, even after months of living here. The air wasn't stale exactly, but it had a certain chemical flavor that no amount of filtration could completely remove. A single screen on my console blinked, drawing my attention. I tapped a key. More numbers. Data from the last particle sweep. Stable entanglement across every frequency. Perfect. Entanglement. The idea that two particles separated by vast distances could share a state, could be intrinsically linked, had fascinated me since I was a young man. And now, after years of speculation, we were about to do the impossible. Not just particles, entire universes. The others had been skeptical, some openly hostile to the idea. Hell, we'd lost half the team before Phase 1. Dr. Harris, my former second-in-command, had practically spit in my face when I mentioned the possibility of linking particles between universes. He said it was too dangerous. But here we were. And Harris was back on Earth, probably festering in some academic institution while I was about to change the future. I stood, stretching my arms. My bones creaked louder than they should have. But it was late. Or early. Hard to tell out here, where night and day didn't mean anything. I crossed the small room toward the viewport, even though I knew there wasn't anything to see. The stars were always the same, distant, indifferent pinpricks. Occasionally, a planet or a faint nebula shimmered far beyond the station, but mostly there was nothing. No Earth, no humanity, just us. And the experiment. Devereaux, you're still awake. The voice behind me caused a slight jolt of surprise, though I quickly smothered it. Adler. She was one of the newer recruits, a junior researcher. Young, maybe too young for this mission. Her voice had an edge to it, the kind that hadn't yet been eroded by years of failure. I'm awake, I replied, not turning. She hadn't earned the right to see whatever expression might have crossed my face just then. Probably nothing but irritation. We're on the verge of history, Adler. Can't sleep. You sure it's history? Or a mistake? I finally turned, narrowing my eyes at her. She stood just inside the doorway, arms crossed over her chest. I'd gotten used to the way she moved, quiet, almost menacing, as though she was always poised to seize on any mistake. You sound like Harris, I said, more dismissively than I intended. She didn't take the bait. Maybe Harris had a point. He was a coward. He was cautious. I shrugged, turning back to the viewport. Caution doesn't get you to the edge of existence. It doesn't break new ground. I don't think we've considered all the variables. I mean, entangling particles across universes. What if there's something we're not? We've considered everything. I cut her off. There's no room for what-ifs at this stage. You know the math. You've seen the simulations. Yeah, I've seen the simulations. I could feel the skepticism rolling off her in waves, but I didn't care. Not anymore. She wasn't the one who had spent a lifetime working toward this moment. She didn't understand. Get some sleep, I said, still not looking at her. Tomorrow's a big day. She lingered for a moment longer, and I wondered if she was going to push back again. But in the end, she left without another word. I exhaled, staring back into the blackness outside the viewport. I knew the others were worried. They didn't say it outright, but it was there, in the silences, in the way they faltered when I walked into the room. They thought I was pushing too hard. Maybe they were right. But the universe didn't wait for the cautious. Tomorrow, we would cross the boundary between the known and the unknown. And for better or worse, I'd be the one leading the charge. I didn't sleep. When I closed my eyes, equations swam in the dark behind my eyelids. Numbers, formulas, potential deviations. But I wasn't worried. If anything, I was eager. I lay there, waiting for the alarm, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft noise of the station. Eventually, I gave up and got out of bed early, putting on the grey uniform that felt like a second layer. The corridors of Asterisk Drift were quiet, as always. The narrow walkways were lit by the occasional red emergency light, casting everything in a faint glow. The regular lights had started dying again, but that was nothing new. Maintenance had been pushed down the priority list ever since we reached Phase 0. As I walked, the station felt almost empty. In a way, it was. We were a skeleton crew, just the handful of us left to see the project through. The others had gone home months ago, replaced by remote-controlled drones to run the less critical systems. I hardly remembered the faces of the people I used to work with. It was the work that mattered, and now the only faces left were those directly tied to the final phase. I reached the control room and found Halverson already there, standing at his console. His eyes flicked up as I entered, the dull glow of the monitors painting his face in artificial light. He gave me a curt nod before turning back to his screen. "All systems green," he said without looking up again. "No anomalies detected. We're ready for Phase 0. I nodded back, my fingers tightening into a fist at my side. Today was the day. Adler entered moments later, still rubbing sleep from her eyes. Her expression was cautious, as always. She still wasn't convinced. "Morning," she muttered, half-heartedly acknowledging us before sliding into her chair, eyes immediately scanning her data feeds. I could see the tension in her posture, the hesitation in every movement. "Morning," I replied, settling into my own chair and bringing up the diagnostic readouts. "Let's get this done." Halverson entered a string of commands into the terminal, and a faint drone filled the station. The entanglement process was beginning. My eyes locked on the central display as the particles on either side of the quantum barrier aligned, their states synchronizing across universes. Minutes passed. Every number, every readout was perfect. A textbook example of success. We had done it. But then something unexpected. A brief disturbance on the comms channel. Not a glitch. Not interference. Something else. A message. It was a garbled signal breaking through the silence. I frowned, staring at the waveform. My hands moved automatically to stabilize the frequency. "What's that?" Adler asked, leaning over to glance at the screen. "Is that—" "Interference," Halverson muttered, eyes darting over the data. "Must be a signal bleed from the entanglement. Nothing we can't—" "No," I interrupted, narrowing my eyes at the monitor. "It's not interference." The signal cleared up slightly, forming into words, distorted, static-filled, but unmistakable. "This, Dr. Marcus, you have to stop." My heart skipped a beat. It was my voice. "What the hell?" Adler was the first to react, her eyes wide as she looked between me and the console. "Is that you?" I said nothing, but I felt a tightness in my chest. The message continued, though the static made it difficult to decipher. Still, the tone was clear. Panic, desperation. "Everything's collapsing. You don't understand what you're doing." Then silence. For a long moment, no one spoke. Halverson's fingers hovered uncertainly over his console, waiting for instructions. Adler stared at me, her mouth slightly open as if she was about to speak but couldn't find the words. "It's a glitch," I said finally, breaking the tension. My voice sounded more certain than I felt. "Interference from the quantum entanglement. Our signals must be crossing with some sort of residual echo from the other universe." "But it was your voice," Adler insisted, her face pale. "That was you, Marcus, from the other side." I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. "It's a side effect of Phase 0. The entanglement process is still in its infancy. Cross-channel interference was always a possibility, especially at this scale." Adler didn't look convinced. Her hands curled into fists. "It didn't sound like interference. It sounded like a warning." "And you're hearing what you want to hear," I shot back, irritation bubbling to the surface. "We're pioneering technology that nobody fully understands yet. Some anomalies are to be expected." I could see the conflict in her eyes. Part of her wanted to argue, but another part knew that we were too far in to stop now. This was what we had worked for, after all. Still, the message lingered in my mind. It wasn't just the voice, it was the tone, the raw fear. "Let's run a diagnostic on the comms system," I said after a beat, trying to force the conversation back into familiar, controlled territory. "I want to make sure that there's no residual interference affecting the signal integrity. Double-check everything before we proceed." Halverson nodded and began typing, though he looked unnerved. Adler hesitated, still watching me closely. I could tell she wanted to press the issue, but for now, she stayed quiet. I was grateful for that. As Halverson worked, I turned back to my own console, reviewing the data. Everything was stable. The entanglement was holding perfectly. There were no signs of fluctuation in the quantum field, no indication that anything was wrong. But the tightness in my chest remained, a dull ache that I couldn't quite shake. After a few minutes, Halverson spoke up. "Diagnostics are clean. No issues with the comm system. Whatever that message was, it wasn't caused by interference on our end." I nodded slowly, though the explanation did little to ease the knot in my stomach. "All right, let's proceed." Adler opened her mouth, ready to object, but then closed it again. She simply watched as I initiated the next phase of the experiment, her silence more damning than any argument she could have made. We pushed forward. Hours passed without further incident, the rhythmic pulse of the station's systems providing a steady backdrop to the data streams that scrolled across our monitors. However, despite my satisfaction with the results, the memory of the message stayed with me. It wasn't possible, I told myself. We were seeing echoes, fragments of communication from the other universe. They didn't mean anything. Yet the more I repeated the explanation, the less I believed it. The voice had been clear. Too clear. My console pinged. Another incoming transmission. I didn't want to look, but I did. The same voice. My voice. "We're too late. You have to stop." And then silence again. I stared at the screen, my throat dry. My pulse quickened, hammering in my chest. I could feel Adler's eyes on me, waiting for my response, but I had none. For the first time, doubt crept in, a crack in the certainty I had built around myself. The voice, my voice, wasn't just a glitch. Something had crossed over. The station felt different the moment the second message ended. I glanced around the room, my eyes catching on every shadow, every subtle movement of the emergency lights overhead. Was I imagining it? "Marcus!" Adler's voice broke through my thoughts. She sounded cautious, afraid to push me too far, but unwilling to stay silent. I didn't answer right away. My hands were tight around the edges of the console, fingers pale with the pressure. I forced myself to release my grip and stood, turning slowly toward her. Her gaze was expansive, the dark rings below hinting at the fatigue she endured. I could see her mind working, see her calculating just how far she could push. "We have to stop the experiment," she said. Whatever this is, it's not just interference anymore. We're opening something." "Opening what exactly?" My voice came out harsher than I intended. "Do you even hear yourself, Adler? We're on the edge of the most significant discovery in human history. We've entangled particles across universes. Of course, there's going to be some instability. Quantum theory isn't some neat package tied up with a bow. It's more than that," she insisted, stepping closer. "The messages, the lights, time itself feels wrong here. Like the station is slipping. You've noticed it too." "Time feels wrong?" I scoffed. "You've been in deep space too long, Adler. You're starting to lose perspective." Her jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought she might lash out. But she just stood there, staring at me with those intense eyes. She wasn't backing down this time. Before I could push her further, Halverson, who had been silently watching from his station, cleared his throat. "Dr. Devereux," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "You might want to take a look at this." I turned to him, feeling the tension creep up my spine. Halverson rarely spoke unless it was important. I walked over to his station, and he tapped a few keys, bringing up the feed from the observation deck. The main monitor activated, showing the station's outer hull. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Just the endless black expanse of space, broken up by the occasional star. But then, I saw a glitch in the image. Like a ripple in water, bending the space around the station, distorting the stars and metal as it passed. It wasn't natural. Space didn't move like that. "What is that?" Adler whispered, leaning in next to me. The ripple moved again. It wasn't a physical object. It was like space itself was bending, like the fabric of reality was being pulled, stretched. For a moment, the station seemed to shimmer, as though it were caught in some invisible current. And then it was gone. Everything snapped back to normal, the feed from the observation deck steady once again, as if nothing had happened. But I had seen it. We all had. I heard Adler mutter something under her breath, something too soft for me to catch, but I didn't need to hear it. I knew what she was thinking. The messages, the warnings, the rift we'd created between universes wasn't theoretical anymore. "Run a full diagnostic," I ordered. "I want to know if that was some kind of local gravitational anomaly or a sensor glitch. Check every system." Halverson was already typing across the console. His voice trembled slightly when he spoke again. "Already on it, sir. But I don't think it was the sensors." Adler didn't move, her eyes still locked on me. I could feel her thoughts, her accusation hanging in the air between us. I could feel time slipping in strange ways, like we were trapped in a loop. I turned back to my console, pulling up the time logs from the last several hours. I blinked, trying to focus on the numbers, but something was off. The timestamps didn't match. I checked them again, my heart pounding faster as I realized what I was seeing. 3 conversations. I had the same conversation with Halverson twice, the same requests, the same orders, 2 hours apart, but both marked with the same timestamp. It wasn't possible. Adler spoke again, softly this time, almost as if she didn't want me to hear. "This isn't interference, Marcus. This is reality. We're breaking it." My eyes scanned the logs again and again, desperate to find a logical explanation, but there wasn't one. The first message from my alternate self was sent an hour before we even started the entanglement process. No, that couldn't be right. A loud clang rang out. The noise reverberated through the floor, sharp and deliberate. "What was that?" Adler's voice was tight with fear now, no longer controlled. I glanced at the ceiling, my heart pounding in my throat. The clang came again, closer. Someone, or something, was moving through the station. Without thinking, I grabbed the nearest object, an old tool I kept lying around on my workstation, and moved toward the door. "Marcus, don't!" Adler hissed, but I wasn't listening anymore. I pressed the button to open the door, revealing the dark hallway beyond. The emergency lights cast everything in a twisted, distorted light, but there was nothing there. No one. I took a step forward, thinking through explanations. Thermal expansion, stress fractures in the hull, maybe a malfunction in the magnetic systems, but none of them fit. The sounds were too deliberate. And then I saw a figure at the end of the hallway. It stood still, just beyond the reach of the light. For a moment I thought it was one of the crew members, someone from maintenance maybe, or a stray shadow playing tricks on me. But then something about the way it moved, or didn't move, made my stomach drop. The figure was distorted, wavering like an old hologram, its edges blurred. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, but my mind rebelled against the image. Its face, it was mine. It didn't move, it just stood there, watching. No, not watching, mirroring. Its stance was identical to mine. Its posture, its clothes. It was me, but not me. My body, broken in some subtle, incomprehensible way, glitching out of sync with reality. I took a step back and it took a step forward. The distortion became worse. Its form quivered, twisting in bizarre ways, its limbs jerking awkwardly, as though it was trying to imitate human movement, but failing. I slammed my hand against the door control. It slid shut, cutting me off from the nightmare in the hallway. What was that?" Adler asked, trembling. I didn't answer. I was trying to comprehend what I had just seen. The warnings, the messages, they weren't just voices from another universe, they were us. The experiment had entangled more than particles. "We've crossed a line," Adler whispered. She sounded far away, her voice distant, like it was coming from the other side of a thick wall. "We've brought something through, and now we can't control it." I stared at the closed door. The station was no longer a research facility. It was a prison, and something had crossed over from the other side. I pressed my back against the door, breathing heavily. The thing, my double, was out there, just beyond the thin partition. I couldn't forget the image of its distorted body, coming in and out of existence like a corrupted video feed. "Marcus, what is happening?" Adler's voice trembled, the fear creeping through her controlled exterior. I turned toward the central console, trying to focus, trying to find some kind of logical anchor to hold on to. But there was none. "They're us," I finally muttered. "Those things, they're us." Adler's expression hardened with disbelief and terror. "What do you mean, they're us? How is that even possible?" I swallowed, staring at the floor as the explanation unspooled in my mind, the horrifying pieces clicking together. The quantum entanglement. We didn't just link particles between universes. We linked ourselves. We've tangled two versions of reality. That thing out there, it's me. From the other side, the side that's collapsing. Adler took a step back, her hand covering her mouth as the realization hit her. "You knew this could happen," she said quietly, her voice thick with accusation. "You knew there were risks." "I didn't know this," I snapped, more out of frustration with myself than with her. "I didn't know the consequences would manifest like this." I had pushed forward, ignoring the warnings, brushing off the doubts. I'd been too focused on the success, on proving that it could be done, that we could control forces beyond our understanding. But now, the universe was reminding me that control was an illusion. "Marcus, we need to shut it down," Adler urged, her voice rising. "We need to stop the experiment now before it gets worse." "It's already too late for that." Halverson spoke for the first time since I'd shut the door. He stood by his console, eyes glued to the screen, sweat dripping down his brow. "It's everywhere. Look at the readings." I joined him at his station, my stomach sinking as I saw the data. The quantum field wasn't just unstable, it was fractured. Readings from every part of the station showed irregularities, time distortions, gravitational anomalies, localized fluctuations in space-time. The experiment had ripped open something far worse than I had imagined. The field's destabilizing everything, Halverson continued. I'm seeing loops in the timestamps, inconsistencies in the environmental controls. We're seeing fluctuations in parts of the station that don't make sense. I clenched my fists, fighting the growing sense of helplessness. What do you mean? Time, Halverson said, looking at me. Time is starting to fracture. The station is slipping in and out of sync. I looked around the room. It looked different. The consoles were in the same place, but the air felt heavier, as though we had shifted somewhere else. Adler glanced around, checking her own instruments. We're not even in the same timeline anymore, she muttered. I swear I've done this before, had this same conversation. I didn't need her to tell me. I felt it too. The nagging sense of déjà vu was creeping into every corner of my mind. Time wasn't linear here anymore. It was coiling in on itself, wrapping us in an endless loop. How many times had we lived this moment already? How many more would we repeat? I moved to my console, scrolling through the logs, but the timestamps were meaningless now. I watched in growing horror as I saw entire blocks of time repeat themselves. An entry from 2 hours ago logged again, word for word, just minutes apart. I had the same conversation with Halverson multiple times, but it was marked with the same timestamp. Marcus! Adler's voice was tight with panic. I've seen this. I've been here before. This moment, it's happened. We're stuck. I wanted to argue, but I couldn't. My own memories were slipping. How many times had I looked at these readings? How many times had I stood in this exact spot? It was impossible to know. The boundaries of reality were breaking down around us, and I was the one who had done it. I slammed my fist onto the console. We need to get out of this loop. We need to... The door opened behind me. I froze. Slowly, I turned. The hallway outside was bathed in the light of the emergency systems, the shadows stretching impossibly long. The same figure from before stood at the threshold, its body moving unpredictably, distorted like a broken image. But now there was more than one. Behind it, another figure emerged, and then another. They weren't human anymore. They had our shapes, but altered. Their faces were blank, oscillating in and out of view, like they were trapped between two realities. Jesus Christ, Adler whispered, stepping back. The doppelgangers moved forward, jerking and glitching. Each step they took seemed to warp the space around them, the floor beneath them bending and rippling, as though the station was being pulled apart by their presence. They're us, I said again. This is what we become. This is what happens when the collapse reaches us. The creatures mirrored our movements, their distorted forms glitching with every breath we took. I took a step back, and they took a step forward. Their eyes locked on mine. They're not attacking, Halverson said. No, I said, realization dawning on me. They're trying to communicate. Adler's head snapped toward me. Communicate? They're abominations. They're not here to talk. They're here to... She didn't finish. One of the figures, a version of herself, jumped forward, reaching out with a hand that seemed to fade in and out of existence. Adler screamed and stumbled back, her expression frozen in horror. I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at the figures, at the versions of us that had crossed over. They weren't hostile. They were desperate to stop us from making the same mistake they had. But they couldn't communicate the way we could. They were too far gone, too twisted by the collapse to be understood. The guilt came over me in waves. This was my doing. I had opened the rift, linked our universe to theirs, and now the collapse was dragging us down with it. We were seeing our inevitable future if we didn't stop the experiment. But how? How could I stop something that had already begun to unravel everything? I need time, I muttered. I need to think. We don't have time! Adler shouted, her voice on the edge of hysteria. They're going to kill us! I didn't know if that was true, but they were doing something worse, showing us what we were destined to become. The station was destabilizing faster than I'd expected. If we didn't act now, it would tear itself apart, and us with it. I could still feel the pull of the experiment, the monumental achievement that was just within our grasp. But I could also see the consequences staring back at me through the forms of the Doppelgangers. We had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The station groaned, the walls warping around us as time itself began to stutter and glitch. I knew what I had to do, but it was going to cost us everything. I moved toward the central console, every muscle in my body taut with the weight of the decision I knew I had to make. I was no longer staring at a scientific achievement. This wasn't about pushing boundaries anymore. It was about survival. It was about stopping the collapse before it spread. But shutting down the experiment wasn't enough. The rift was too far gone. The Doppelgangers weren't invaders. They were victims. Victims of the same collapse that was now trying to consume us. I looked up at the monitors. The static-filled feed from the outer hull activated, showing the massive distortion forming around the station. It was no longer a ripple, no longer some glitch in the system. It was a tear, a wound in the fabric of space expanding outward. And within that tear, I saw Earth. It wasn't the Earth I remembered. It was distant, blurred, coming in and out of existence just like our doubles. I realized then that the collapse was spreading through the entangled universes, unraveling time and space as it went. My alternate self had tried to warn me. The collapse had already reached my future, and soon it would reach everything. They're not trying to kill us, I realized. They're trying to stop us. These things, these doppelgangers, they're what happens when the collapse reaches us. They've already been through it. They're trying to stop us from making the same mistake, but they can't stop it themselves. They need us to stop it. Halvorson, his face pale and slick with sweat, looked at me as if I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had, but deep down, I knew I was right. They weren't attacking us because they couldn't. Their forms had been so distorted by the collapse that they were trapped in this liminal state, unable to cross over fully, but still desperate to communicate. Adler shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. Then how do we stop it? How do we end this? I turned back to the console. I knew the answer. I had always known. There was only one way to stop the rift, to sever the entanglement between universes. We destroy the station. We have to collapse the quantum field, detonate the core. If we take out the station, we sever the link, and the rift will close. Adler blinked, unable to process what was being said. You're talking about killing us, destroying everything. Yes, it's the only way. Our doubles stood still, watching, fading like smouldering embers on the edge of existence. The collapse was coming for us, and it was only a matter of time before we were dragged into the same fate. How long do we have? Halvorson asked. Once I initiate the sequence, we'll have 5 minutes. Enough time to get clear if we're lucky. Clear? Adler said, her voice shaking with disbelief. Clear to where? There's nowhere to go. I ignored her, pulling up the station's self-destruct sequence. The system resisted. Probably another result of the field distortions. But after a moment, it responded. A countdown timer appeared on the screen, ready to be activated. Marcus, Adler's voice softened, almost pleading now. There has to be another way. We can't just die here. I'm not asking you to die, I said quietly. I'm asking you to help me save the universe. A beat of silence, then Halvorson nodded slowly. Do it. Adler stared at us in shock. You're both insane. Maybe, I muttered, entering the final command. But we've got no other choice. I pressed the button and the countdown began. 5 minutes, I muttered, watching the timer tick down. We need to move. But just as I turned toward the exit, our distorted doppelgangers moved. One of them, my doppelganger, approached. It reached out, its hand glitching, shifting between dimensions as it tried to close the distance between us. For a brief moment I felt its desperation, its need to communicate. But there was nothing left to say. I had made my choice. The doppelganger stopped, its hand hovering inches from my face. And then, as the station's walls began to buckle, it disappeared, vanishing like a dying star. "They're gone," Halverson whispered, staring at the spot where they had been. "They just vanished." They weren't real anymore, not in the way we are. They were remnants of a collapsing universe. And now that we've set the sequence, they know it's over. Adler looked like she was about to collapse, her eyes glassy. "We're really doing this," she whispered. "Yes," I said, my tone final. "We are." We moved quickly, navigating the collapsing station as best we could. The walls bent, and the floors shifted beneath our feet as reality began to warp. The rift was closing, but the process was tearing the station apart. The countdown on my wristwatch ticked down, each second reminding me that there was no turning back. We reached the escape pods. What was left of them, anyway? Most had been damaged by the field distortions, changed into unrecognizable shapes. But one remained functional. Halverson moved to the controls, preparing the pod for launch. "We don't have much time," he muttered, glancing at the timer. "Less than 2 minutes." I nodded, stepping into the pod. But as Adler moved to follow, she stopped, staring at me with anger and sorrow. "You're staying," she said. It wasn't a question. I looked into her eyes, the weight of my decision crushing me from the inside. "Yes." Halverson froze. "What?" "I have to be sure," I said quietly. "If something goes wrong, I need to be here to make sure the core detonates properly. The rift has to close." "Marcus, no," Adler whispered, her voice breaking. "You can't." "I have to," I interrupted, my tone firm. "This is my responsibility. I'm the one who opened the rift. I'm the one who has to close it." Adler's face crumpled and she stepped forward as if to argue, but Halverson grabbed her arm, pulling her into the pod. "He's right. We have to go." The pod door slid shut, sealing them inside. I watched as the launch sequence activated, the thrusters roaring to life. For a moment I thought about joining them, about getting on that pod and taking the chance that we might survive. But I knew better. There was no escaping this. Not for me. I stepped back, watching as the escape pod launched into the void, leaving me alone in the collapsing station. The timer on my wristwatch ticked down. 10 seconds. 9. I closed my eyes, the rumble of the station's impending destruction surrounding me. 5. 4. I opened my eyes, staring out at the stars one last time. 3. 2. The rift flashed, and for a moment I saw Earth again, faint, distant but whole. 1. The station exploded in a brilliant flash of light, and the rift was gone. For a moment there was nothing but silence. No alarms, no metal groaning as the station collapsed around me. No dimming lights, no distorted figures stepping out of the shadows. Just silence and the cold, distant stars beyond the viewport. Then darkness. I don't know how long I was unconscious, or if I even was. Time had lost all meaning long ago, its boundaries frayed by the collapse. When I opened my eyes again, if I ever really closed them, everything was still. No explosion, no fire, no rift. I blinked, once, twice. The silence remained, but something had changed. I was floating, weightless, suspended in the vacuum where the station once existed. The harsh reality of space surrounded me, but there was no sensation, no pain, no cold. Was I dead? The thought drifted through my mind as easily as a whisper, but I didn't have the answer. All I knew was that I had done it. I had closed the rift. Our doppelgangers. They were gone, along with the collapse, sealed away by the destruction of the Astris drift. I had severed the entanglement. I had sacrificed the station. Myself. Everything. I drifted in that endless expanse, staring at the distant stars, and wondered if anyone would ever know what we had done, if anyone would even remember. or if we were just another casualty in the march of scientific progress, forgotten, erased by time as easily as the station had been erased by the collapse. Somewhere, far away, I could sense movement, a tiny light in the distance. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, but my mind was sluggish, my thoughts slipping away. The light drew closer, and I realized it wasn't just a light. It was the escape pod. Halverson and Adler. They made it. I watched as the pod's thrusters burned bright against the backdrop of space, pushing it farther and farther from where the station had once been. They were heading home, heading to Earth. But as the pod drifted farther away, something else caught my eye. Something beyond the pod, beyond the stars, at the very edge of perception. A ripple. It was faint, but it was there, the fabric of space bending, distorting. I blinked again, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. It couldn't be real. The rift was gone. I had destroyed it. I had stopped the collapse. But the ripple remained, growing larger. My chest tightened as the realization hit me. Our alternate selves, they hadn't been trying to warn me about the collapse. They hadn't been trying to stop me from linking the universes. They were fleeing their own collapsing universe, trying to escape into ours. And now, the rift was gone. The station was destroyed. But the collapse hadn't stopped. It had only spread. I watched, helpless, as the ripple expanded, engulfing the distant stars one by one. The escape pod, now nothing more than a tiny dot in the vast expanse of space, continued its journey back to Earth. Back to a world that had no idea what was coming. I had failed. In the end, the collapse wasn't something I could stop. It wasn't something that could be destroyed or contained. It was a force of nature, a consequence of our arrogance, our hubris. We had entangled ourselves with forces beyond our understanding, and now the price had to be paid. I had tried to save the universe. But in the end, some things were never meant to be saved. The collapse had already begun, and there was no stopping it.